Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Sky in the Shy podcast. I'm your host, Edwin Garcia, and I've waited so long and been so eager to launch this podcast. So I'm so excited, very excited. It's episode 1. I wanted to do an episode 0, and unfortunately, time got away from me, and episode 0 doesn't really make much sense when the season's about to start. So we're going to jump right in. Episode 1 and get it going. The cadence and flow of this first episode will be a little different than the other ones will be, because for this one I'm going to kind of start with some personal anecdotes and kind of my feelings on the sport, on the game, and on the team. I'll try to keep it short because, as you'll see, sometimes I can ramble a little bit. But I wanted to talk real briefly about that. In general, most episodes, I won't have a little soliloquy in the beginning. I'll just jump right into the action, what's been going on, the news, and whatever the main topic is for the podcast episode. But I wanted to talk about why this podcast is coming out and what I think is going to contribute to the Chicago Sky fan base, the community, WNBA, and basketball as a whole. So I've had a passion for this team for many years, and anyone who's followed me on Twitter, Sky in the Shy, you've seen I'm tweeting regularly, I'm writing articles, and this year I wanted to ramp things up a bit. I wanted to take that next level. I wanted to really be the premier source for everyone on Chicago Sky news and coverage, and that entailed me making the time to start videos on my YouTube channel, start this podcast, and get more and more aggressive in my covering of the team on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So I'm really excited about it, and it's something I've really wanted to do, but it's hard to justify the time and to get the resources, and it's more to it, because I don't want this to be a podcast that has 4 or 5 episodes, takes a huge break, and then, eventually I give up on it. I'm here for the long haul. I wanted to make sure I could make that commitment to you so you could know, okay, this podcast is going to keep coming out and it's going to be consistent. And obviously, there's still a wait and see approach, because I could totally fall flat on my face, but I'm now focused, prepared, and I think I'm set up in a position where I'm going to succeed, and this podcast can grow and continue being a staple in your feed, something you listen to, something you enjoy. Now, this podcast will be available on all streaming platforms. It's also available on my YouTube channel with my wonderful face. So if you want to see me talking and conversating about the Chicago Sky, YouTube is going to be the place to be. I don't know if I'll always do it. I'm going to see some feedback, hear what all of you think about it. If you just want a still image of the podcast logo and my audio, I'll make sure it's always available on YouTube. I love watching podcasts on YouTube myself, so I try to think about that when I think about the audience. So I'm going to start with that, and if people say, hey, I don't care, or if really the numbers are really, really bad and I think it's just better to just have the audio with an image or something, I'll do that. If not, I have no problem just having my face. There won't be much action. There won't be any other little images really on this podcast, but maybe in the future I'll add one here and there depending on what information is important. All right, so that's enough about me and my feelings. Of course, if you have any comments or questions, you can leave them here on the YouTube comment section, or leave it in the form of a 5-star review on iTunes, and I will respond to it either there, on Twitter, however you kind of want that information answered. So any other questions about me or my passions for this team, or just anything in general, always down to talk in the YouTube comment section or on my Twitter, which is @SkyInTheShy. All right, so let's get into this roster. Right now, the time of this recording, it is May 13th, and the Chicago Sky season is officially starting Saturday against the Washington Mystics. So yes, we've had training camp, we've had media day, we've had preseason games, but it really doesn't kick off until it kicks off. And it kicks off for the Chicago Sky on Saturday in Washington against the Mystics. So I wanted to talk about the roster changes, because we went through a lot during this training camp. The Chicago Sky brought a lot of players to training camp. The Chicago Sky brought 20 players to training camp, and as we found out later from James Wade, due to salary cap issues, the team can only have 11 players on the roster. Normally it's 12, but financially they can only have 11. So to bring 20 when you can only have 11, and we already know most spots are taken because they're the starters and stars, right? Courtney Vandersloot, Allie Quigley, Diamond DeShields, Candace Parker, biggest new addition. Obviously, they're not really trying out. They're going to make the team. And there's a few other names there that I felt extremely comfortable and confident that they were going to be on the team. So I thought that number was a bit big, and I already saw that it was going to be really tough to get to 11. And I saw that it was going to be some frustrated fans, and obviously the players are going to be upset about not making the roster and things like that. They understand the business, but it just seemed like that's a lot of players. But James Wade had his reasons, and training camp for me it was pretty rough because many players, coming back from overseas, having to quarantine, go through the protocols, getting their visas. We know Shyla Heel has never actually been part of training camp. She made the roster, but she didn't actually play at all. She's going to be temporarily suspended because she actually still hasn't been able to go through the health and safety protocols. So that's been just an ongoing issue with many of the Chicago Sky players and players around the league. So it's no one's fault, but it is definitely a unique scenario and a frustrating one that these players just haven't really had a chance to play together, and this was really not much of a training camp, at least in terms of getting the core together and getting the opportunity to see a few other players and have them playing with the core players in the team. You didn't really get that due to all these scenarios. So I have the unofficial roster here because on the actual Chicago Sky website, they still need to update things. Now, this roster was just solidified today, so I understand, but if you go trying to cross-check this information right now, the website's actually not very accurate, but I'm sure it'll be accurate in the next 24 hours or so. So hopefully maybe by the time this podcast is up on Friday or Saturday morning, depending on if it goes through Apple Podcasts and everything quickly, hopefully the website also matches this information. But in case you're looking at both, that's why there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. So here's the unofficial Chicago Sky roster. We have Courtney Vandersloot, Allie Quigley, Kalia Copper, Diamond DeShields, Candace Parker, Stevens, Stephanie Dolson, Astuna Nadu, Ruthie Hebert, Shyla Heel, and number 11, Stephanie Watts. Now, we already mentioned that Shyla Heel is going to be temporarily suspended, and one of the players that was waived on the very last day was Brittany Boyd. And according to Annie Costable, who, if you're not following on Twitter, you definitely should because she's an amazing Chicago Sky reporter, she tweeted out that the team is going to pursue the hardship exemption and bring her back for the season opener, along with Shyla Heel being suspended, so that way they can kind of open up that roster spot and kind of move things around. So good chance Brittany Boyd comes back. We'll have to see what the league says about that and if they actually approve. But as of right now, those are the 11 players that are on the roster. Now, as I mentioned before, with a size of a roster of 20, trimming it down to 11, going to be some fans that were frustrated and players that were frustrated. And you saw a lot of that very last day when so many players got released kind of at the last minute, the last moment to kind of do so. On the very last day, for example, Brittany Boyd, Alexis Prince, Lexi Brown, Kobe Thornton, and Natasha Mack were all released from the team. They're waived. And from those players, obviously Natasha Mack just got drafted, so that felt like a frustrating experience. I'm definitely a Prince fan. I've always liked their game. I think she's a really good role player, but again, I understand the situation. And Lexi Brown was the one that many fans seem to have been clamoring for. It tended to be a conversation, especially on Twitter, about Stephanie Watts versus Lexi Brown and how did Watts get that position. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see as things progress with the team, how good Watts is and things like that. There's not that many spots on the roster, so it'll be that'll be something that most fans will be looking at, and I'll be looking at. How does Stephanie Watts play? What does James Wade see in her that maybe other people just haven't had a chance to understand or know? For me, in general, I'm okay with the decisions. They're hard decisions. With the lack of ability to watch preseason games and things like that, I don't have much tape on these players interacting with each other. Most of us don't. A couple sizzle reels, which I do appreciate, but it's not really the kind of access where I can actually form an opinion about, a rookie versus a veteran and things like that. So I definitely like Lexi Brown's game, but decisions were made, and we'll just have to wait and see if those decisions were correct. And that's what, James Wade and the coaching staff's job is to assess those players, to make those tough decisions, and to come out right more than wrong. And, last thing you want is Lexi Brown has an amazing season somewhere else, and Watts never sees the floor, and people are wondering, why wasn't that player here? So we'll have to wait and see. But overall, I don't have too many problems with the roster. I'm pretty happy with it. I understand the players that we're missing and why. I think the main thing a lot of people have been talking about, and the noise has gotten very loud, is the fact that there needs to be more roster spots and there needs to be more expansion, because there are a lot of really great players who just aren't getting opportunities because of the fact there aren't that many spots available in the WNBA. So that's something that we'll have to look at further down the road. Obviously, there's nothing you can do this season. WNBA has kind of mentioned here and there that they're looking into expansion, and it'll probably happen in a couple years, and something they're looking into and things like that. Nothing really that you can hold them accountable for, but enough to make you feel like it's likely to happen, more likely than less likely. And I'm definitely for it, because I've always said it. The WNBA is one of the hardest leagues in the sport, strictly due to the lack of roster spots, how hard it is to be on a team. That means that pretty much every WNBA player is at extremely high level, and that means that there's so much parity because there's not that many roster spots, not that many places for players to go, so every team has good players, and that makes it that much more competitive. It's such a competitive, hard league because of that. And adding some more players will add depth, and it'll maybe add nuance between, the elite teams, the middle teams, and further down the road. With how many teams there are, this league is absolutely brutal. It's one of the most difficult leagues in any sport, really, simply due to roster size. All right, now that we have the roster solidified and when we've talked about that, it's time to get into the games. And then that's what it's all about. We're all here because we love watching basketball, and we're about to watch a lot of basketball as the Chicago Sky season starts on May 15th. So what I want to do here is go through the games that are going to happen between the airing of this podcast and the start of the next podcast. So one thing I failed to mention earlier is this podcast will be bi-monthly, meaning there'll be one podcast episode every 2 weeks, and we'll continue going that way through the end of the season, whenever the Chicago Sky season ends. Hopefully it ends at the end with a championship, but whenever it ends, that's when I will conclude the bi-monthly flow of the episodes. That way you can consistently understand when they're coming out. Now, I do want to ramp up to weekly, but as you can imagine, gathering information, putting it on camera, editing, etc., it does take a lot of time and energy. And to do that, right now I can definitely commit to bi-monthly. I cannot, unfortunately, commit to weekly. It's just going to put too much of a strain on my schedule. But I do want to do it. And I'm holding back on wanting to do it because I just know it's going to take a lot out of me to do it the way I want to do it. So one thing I've done is I've started a Patreon to help support this podcast, support the work that I'm doing. I'm going to be doing game recaps this season, feature articles, weekly news roundup, a Chicago Sky just YouTube video in general. Well, there'll be 2 of those a month, and 2 podcast episodes a month. So that's what I'm doing. And if you want to support that work, go ahead and join my Patreon. You can start with as little as $1. You can just throw in $1 just to say, hey, I support you and I support what you're doing. I want you to keep on doing it. I need to make sure that I'm giving my all, but I'm also have to make sure I'm somehow getting compensated for it as well. So that way I can justify it to my family and everyone, all this work that I'm doing and all the games that I'm watching and all that. There are some people who very much care about me, but also are wondering, why are you doing all this? And the reason I'm doing it is because it's the profession I'm pursuing, it's the work that I love, and it's the community that I want to help build and grow. And I want there to be these kind of videos from a lot of different creators and a lot of different journalists sharing their knowledge and their experience. So this is me putting my hat in that ring, and if you want to support that, a contribution as low as $1 would help me immensely. So on my Patreon, I have a goal for once we reach $1,000 a month, I will move this from twice a month to once a week. And I'm really excited about that idea. I'm really excited to do that and do that consistently throughout the year, throughout the season. But for right now, we're going to do this bi-monthly thing, see how it goes, and take things from there. So again, if you want to, if you have the means, I'd really appreciate it if you would support me on Patreon. So from now until the very next podcast episode, which will be on the week of the 23rd to the 29th. I haven't finalized what day I'm going to release the podcast episodes on. On Patreon, you'll get at least a 24-hour exclusive where you'll get the episode first, but then it'll be released to the public the next morning. I haven't talked with my community or with people who are going to be listening to the podcast to say, hey, when would you like the podcast to come out? So right now I'm either thinking at the start of the week on Monday or at the end of the week on Thursday/Friday going into the weekend. So leave a comment below. When do you think would be the best time to release podcasts? When do you think would be the best time to get the information and then move on from there? I've looked at the Chicago Sky schedule to try to kind of finalize that, but I just haven't really even set myself up for a definitive time yet. But I know it'll come out that week. So if we're taking that into account, that means that there will absolutely be 3 games that pass minimum from now until the very next time this podcast airs. So I want to go through the 3 games that I know will happen and what I think the scores will be next time that you are on the podcast and where we're at with the team. So let's break down the next 3 games the Chicago Sky have. The Chicago Sky are facing this Saturday the Washington Mystics. Then on Wednesday the 19th, they're playing the Atlanta Dream. And on Sunday the 23rd, they are playing the New York Liberty. Now, I've actually predicted the entire Chicago Sky schedule on my YouTube channel. I did a fun video where I looked at the entire schedule and I predicted all the wins, losses, and came up with the final record. Since you're listening to the podcast, I'll kind of give away the ending there. And I predicted they'll go 19-13, which I'm not sure if that's going to be above or below people's expectations, but that's what I predicted. And really all I did was I looked at the schedule, and when there were some really tough games, I gave the opponent the respect and said they might pull that out. And when there's teams that were kind of, lower tier teams that are maybe not going to make the playoffs, I gave the Chicago Sky the win. And then I just tried to parse out the nuance of the games in between. And when I did that, I came up with 19-13. So that's my prediction before any games have happened. Obviously, so much can happen. Injuries can occur. Some players can get hot. Some players can get cold. Some teams that I think are weak might actually be strong. Some teams that I think are strong might actually end up being weak. But I feel pretty comfortable with that 19-13. Maybe 20-12 would have sounded a little nicer, but when I looked at the schedule, that's what I came up with. But now that we're doing the podcast, I'll go into depth of each game, and I will actually adjust my opinion based on what's happening, since we'll be watching the games and seeing how the team's doing, and the scenarios will make a little more sense on the day-to-day, week-to-week that they're happening than it did in my YouTube video where I did it all before any basketball was played. Okay, so for these 3 games, this is how I see them happening and what I think will happen. So against the Washington Mystics, honestly, I think the Chicago Sky are likely to lose that game. It's an early morning game, 12 p.m. Central Time, right? So that's one thing. It's going to be on a Saturday with a very good Washington Mystics team. And I just mentioned earlier that the team hasn't really had time to practice and play and gel together because of all the safety protocols and players coming in late to training camp and things like that. And I think that's going to cause the Chicago Sky to be a bit rusty and off going into the beginning of the season. I think they'll be fine. At the end of the day, I think they'll get into a flow, they'll get into a rhythm, they'll get into a schedule, and things will be just fine. I definitely think the Chicago Sky have a really, really great chance of winning the title. And for me, they're my title favorites. But I do think they will struggle early on with rotations, with chemistry, with rust. All those things are going to factor in, and with such a short training camp that didn't really have all the players there, I think that's going to impact them on the court immediately. So I think they're going to lose that first game against the Washington Mystics. And on Wednesday against the Atlanta Dream, and on Sunday against the New York Liberty, I think the Chicago Sky will pull out victories on those 2 games, and they'll kind of start ramping up and start gelling together as a team more and more as the games go on. So I have them going 2-1 in their first 3 games. And after that, I'll have another podcast episode. So we'll see if I was right. We'll see if I was wrong. We'll see what's been happening. But that's what I think will happen for these first 3 games here in May. Okay, so we're nearing the end of this podcast episode. Obviously, as the season ramps up, these episodes will get a bit longer. In general, I think you can expect a 45-minute to 1-hour podcast from me. And the podcast kind of flow will be opening up with the news, opening up with what's happened in the previous games, what's happening in the current games, and maybe an overarching theme based on what's happening. So depending on the scenarios, maybe a player is on a hot streak, maybe a player is struggling, maybe I think a role player deserves a little bit more attention, and I'll talk about them here on the podcast, and we can kind of go in a little bit deeper and talk about those players and what's going on with the team. But right now, the way things are, there isn't much of that information, so I'm going to keep it a little bit short for this first episode, kind of as an introduction, and we'll ramp up from here. But that's what you can expect, about a 45-minute to 1-hour podcast, more or less. On my website, skyintheshy.wordpress.com, you can check out news roundups every week. I'll be doing the news on what's happened in the games, what's happened the week prior, and what I think you should be expecting and looking forward to in the upcoming week. I do that every Monday, so every Monday morning. Check the website. If you go on my Twitter, you'll never miss it because I tweet about it as soon as it's out with the link to the article, and that's where you can keep up with the news that's happening with the team. I'll be doing game recaps as well on the website. again, that'll be in-depth conversations on what happened, who the player of the game was, why the team lost, why the team won, details like that. And I'll be doing one big feature article every week on one of these bigger topics, just like I'll do on the podcast, where I'll go in depth on a specific scenario, something about the team that I'm liking or not liking, or a player that's playing well, poor, etc. So there'll be a chance for me to talk a little bit more about the nuance of a certain scenario with the team. So I'm really excited about this season. I think this is the first season that I can really feel like this team should win the championship, should be in the running to win the championship. They're extremely deep, they're experienced. Third year James Wade coaching some of these players. They added a superstar and they didn't lose anything by adding the superstar. They just paid the contract and they got a superstar in Candace Parker. So I'm going to be really interested to see what happens this season. I'm really excited for it, and it'll be a season where the Chicago Sky are legitimate title contenders, and we'll see how they live with that pressure and how they play in that circumstance, which I don't think they've ever been in. They've never really been front runners. I know the Chicago Sky community believes in them, but I think the WNBA as a whole, it was kind of like, yeah, we'll talk about them when we have to talk about them. And this season, they're being talked about immediately. So I think that's interesting, and I'm going to be very interested to see how the team reacts to this new standard that's being set for them based on the expectations of the roster. All right, that's it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening to it, and thank you so much for supporting me in any way you can. If you are on iTunes, make sure you give this podcast a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, just like, subscribe. That really supports, really helps push the video up so other people can see it and other people can understand what I'm doing and even know, hey, Chicago Sky are playing, it's a WNBA team. You know, you'd be surprised how many people don't even know what's going on in the WNBA. So I want more and more eyes on this, more and more people interested in the WNBA and in the work that I'm doing to cover the Chicago Sky. So thank you so much, and I'll talk to you in the next podcast episode.